August 1945. A basement cell in Osaka, Japan. Marcus McDilda kneels on cold concrete, hands bound behind his back. Blood drips from his jaw. His flight suit is torn. A Japanese officer stands over him, sword drawn, the blade catching dim light. The interrogation has already failed once. McDilda knows nothing about atomic weapons. He is a fighter pilot, not a scientist. But the officer does not believe him. The sword rises. In the next 10 seconds, McDilda will tell a lie so precise, so convincing, that it will reshape the final days of the war. The cell measured roughly 8 feet by 6. Windowless. A single electric bulb hung from a frayed cord above, casting a pale yellow circle on the floor where McDilda knelt. The walls were damp. The air smelled of mildew, sweat, and something metallic that might have been old blood. He had been brought here after the first round of questioning. That session had lasted 2 hours. The questions had started simple: name, rank, unit, aircraft type. Then they had turned sharper. "What do you know about the bomb? Where are the others? How many more cities?" McDilda had answered with the truth, which was almost nothing. He was a P-51 pilot. He flew escort missions. He strafed airfields. He had never seen an atomic bomb, never been briefed on one, never even heard the term until 3 days ago, when Hiroshima had ceased to exist in a single flash of light. The interrogators did not believe him. Now, in the basement, the questions had stopped. The officer standing over him was not asking any more. He was deciding. McDilda could see the man's boots, polished despite the grime of the room. He could hear breathing, slow and controlled, from somewhere behind him where 2 guards stood. The sword remained raised. In that moment, the mathematics of survival reduced to a single variable. The Japanese believed every American pilot knew something about the atomic program. They believed this because the weapon had changed everything. 3 days after Hiroshima, the empire was reeling. The military command was desperate for intelligence, for any fragment of understanding that might explain what had happened and what was coming next. McDilda understood none of this in strategic terms. He understood only that the man with the sword was waiting for an answer that would either satisfy him or end the conversation permanently. The truth was useless. McDilda had already told it. He was a fighter pilot from Wortham, Texas. He had trained at fields across the American South. He had flown Mustangs over the Pacific for 5 months. He knew nothing about nuclear physics, nothing about the Manhattan Project, nothing about the B-29 that had dropped the bomb. But the truth had not worked. The sword began to descend. McDilda spoke. He did not plan what came next. He did not rehearse it. The words arrived from somewhere between instinct and terror, a fabrication so elaborate that it would later astonish the intelligence officers who debriefed him. He told the Japanese officer that he knew about the bomb. He said there were more. He described in technical-sounding language that he invented on the spot how the weapon worked. He named targets. He gave numbers. He spoke with the calm authority of a man who had been briefed at the highest levels. None of it was true, but it was enough. The sword stopped. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. Marcus McDilda was born in 1921 in Wortham, Texas, a small town southeast of Waco where the land flattened into cotton fields and the summers pressed down like a weight. His father worked the soil. His mother kept the house. There was no money for luxuries, but there was enough for food, church on Sundays, and a radio that brought the wider world into their kitchen. He was not a remarkable student. He was not a troublemaker. He was quiet, observant, and steady in ways that teachers noted but rarely praised. He finished high school in 1939, the same year Germany invaded Poland and took odd jobs around the county while the news from Europe grew darker. When Pearl Harbor came, McDilda was 20 years old. He enlisted within weeks, not out of patriotic fervor, but out of a practical understanding that the war was coming whether he volunteered or not. He requested aviation. The Army Air Forces were expanding faster than any other branch, and pilots were needed by the thousands. His aptitude tests placed him in the fighter track. He was sent to primary training in Texas, then basic in Arizona, then advanced in California. The progression took 18 months. He learned to fly the PT-17 Stearman, the BT-13 Valiant, and finally the AT-6 Texan. Each aircraft was faster, heavier, and less forgiving than the last. Each one taught him something about the relationship between speed, weight, and the thin margin that separated controlled flight from disaster. By early 1944, he was rated as a fighter pilot. He was assigned to the P-51 Mustang, the aircraft that would define the final years of the air war in both Europe and the Pacific. The Mustang was a revelation. It combined the speed of a pursuit aircraft with the range of a medium bomber, thanks to its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and the drop tanks that could extend its reach to over 1,500 miles. For a pilot trained on trainers and transitional aircraft, the P-51 felt like stepping from a rowboat into a racing yacht. McDilda learned its rhythms, the way the engine note changed at different throttle settings, the vibration in the stick that signaled the approach of a stall, the narrowness of the landing gear, which punished sloppy touchdowns. He flew training missions over the California desert, mock dogfights against other cadets, and long navigation exercises that tested his ability to hold a heading for hours without visual reference. He was not the best pilot in his class. He was not the worst. He was competent, reliable, and calm under pressure, qualities that mattered more in combat than raw talent ever did. By late 1944, he was assigned to the Pacific Theater. He shipped out from San Francisco in January 1945, bound for the island chains that American forces were slowly wresting from Japanese control. He arrived at Iwo Jima in April, just weeks after the Marines had secured the airfield at the cost of nearly 7,000 dead. The island was still being cleared of Japanese holdouts when McDilda landed his Mustang for the first time. The runway was rough, patched with crushed coral and littered with debris that the ground crews had not yet removed. The air smelled of sulfur from the volcanic vents and something else, something organic and sweet, that he learned not to ask about. He was assigned to the 21st Fighter Group, a unit tasked with escorting B-29 bombers on their long runs to the Japanese home islands. The missions were grueling. 12 hours in a cramped cockpit, most of it over open ocean with nothing below but water that would kill you in minutes if you went down. The Mustangs flew top cover while the superfortresses droned toward their targets, dropped their payloads, and turned for home. McDilda flew 23 missions between April and August 1945. He engaged Japanese fighters twice, claiming one probable and one damaged. He strafed airfields, rail yards, and coastal shipping. He watched friends go down and did not see them again. By August, the war felt like it was ending, but no one knew how. The Japanese had been pushed back to their home islands, but they showed no sign of surrender. The invasion of the mainland, scheduled for November, loomed over every pilot like a sentence. Then Hiroshima happened, and 3 days later, Nagasaki. And 1 day after that, Marcus McDilda climbed into his Mustang for what would be his final mission. August 8, 1945. The mission was a fighter sweep over Osaka, part of the ongoing effort to suppress Japanese air defenses ahead of the expected invasion. McDilda's flight consisted of 4 P-51Ds, loaded with ammunition and enough fuel for the round trip with a thin reserve. They took off from Iwo Jima at dawn. The weather was clear over the ocean, but reports indicated cloud cover building over the Japanese coast. The flight leader briefed them on the primary target, a cluster of airfields northwest of Osaka, where reconnaissance had spotted dispersed aircraft hidden under camouflage netting. McDilda flew number 3 position, off the leader's right wing. The formation held tight as they climbed to cruise altitude, then loosened as they settled into the long transit. The Pacific stretched below them, endless and featureless, a blue void that offered no landmarks and no mercy. 3 hours into the flight, the coast of Japan appeared as a gray line on the horizon. The cloud cover had thickened, but there were gaps. The flight leader adjusted their heading, steering toward a break that would bring them over the target area with enough visibility to identify ground installations. They descended through the clouds at 14,000 feet. The turbulence was moderate, enough to jostle the aircraft, but not enough to scatter the formation. McDilda kept his eyes on the leader's wing, maintaining spacing through the murk. When they broke through, the ground rushed up to meet them. Green hills, rice paddies, a river snaking toward the sea. The airfield was ahead, exactly where the briefing had placed it. McDilda could see revetments, dispersal areas, and the dark shapes of aircraft tucked beneath netting. The attack began. The flight leader rolled into his dive, followed by number 2. McDilda pushed his stick forward, felt the Mustang's nose drop, and watched the airspeed climb. The ground expanded in his windscreen. He lined up on a row of revetments, squeezed the trigger, and felt the .650 caliber guns hammer. Tracers arced downward. Dirt erupted. Something exploded, a fuel dump or an ammunition store, sending a column of black smoke into the air. He pulled up, banking hard to avoid the smoke, and that was when the anti-aircraft fire found him. The first burst passed beneath his wing. The second hit the engine cowling. The Mustang shuddered. Oil sprayed across the windscreen, instantly coating it in a dark film that reduced visibility to a narrow slit at the bottom where the glass was still clear. The engine note changed, roughened, began to miss. The temperature gauge climbed. McDilda knew the mathematics instantly. He was over enemy territory at low altitude with a dying engine and no chance of reaching the coast. The ocean was more than 100 miles away. Even if the engine held, he would never make it. He called out his situation on the radio. The flight leader acknowledged, but there was nothing anyone could do. The other Mustangs were already climbing, regrouping, preparing for the long flight home. McDilda was on his own. He nursed the aircraft south, looking for open ground. The engine coughed, coughed again. Oil pressure dropped to 0. The propeller began to windmill, no longer driven by anything but airflow. He was gliding now, a 20-ton aircraft transformed into the world's worst sailplane. The ground came up fast. He spotted a field, relatively flat, bordered by trees on one side and a low stone wall on the other. It was not a runway, but it was the best option available. He lowered his landing gear. The hydraulics still functioned, which was a small mercy. The wheels locked into place. He aligned with the field, held the nose up as long as he dared, and let the Mustang settle. The touchdown was violent. The gear hit hard, bounced, hit again. The aircraft slewed left as one wheel sank into soft earth. The wing dipped, caught the ground, and the Mustang spun, shedding pieces as it went. McDilda was thrown against his harness, then sideways, then forward as the aircraft finally stopped. He was alive. He was also surrounded within minutes. Farmers with hoes and rakes, then soldiers, then a truck that took him away from the wreckage before the fuel tanks could ignite. He did not resist. There was no point. His sidearm had been lost in the crash. His leg was injured, possibly broken. He was behind enemy lines, alone, and entirely at the mercy of people who had every reason to hate him. The hood went over his head before they loaded him into the truck. He did not see daylight again for 2 days. The Japanese military intelligence apparatus in August 1945 was operating under conditions that combined desperation with rigid protocol. The atomic bombings had shattered assumptions that had governed Japanese strategy for years. The weapon that destroyed Hiroshima was unlike anything in the existing military lexicon. It was not a large conventional bomb. It was not an incendiary raid. It was something new, something that suggested the Americans had crossed a threshold that the Japanese had not even known existed. In the days following Hiroshima, intelligence officers across Japan were ordered to gather any information they could about the weapon. Captured American airmen became priority assets. Every pilot, navigator, bombardier, or gunner who fell into Japanese hands was interrogated with a new urgency. The interrogators operated from a set of assumptions that shaped their questions and their expectations. They assumed that the atomic bomb program was widely known within the American military. They assumed that pilots flying over Japan had been briefed on the weapon, its targets, and its capabilities. They assumed that information could be extracted through a combination of pressure, deprivation, and the credible threat of execution. These assumptions were wrong, but the interrogators did not know that. The Manhattan Project had been one of the most closely guarded secrets in American history. Fewer than 100 people understood the full scope of the program. Most military personnel, including the crews of the B-29s that dropped the bombs, had been told only what they needed to know for their specific missions. Fighter pilots like McDilda had been told nothing at all, but the Japanese interrogators could not imagine this level of compartmentalization. In their experience, military organizations shared information more broadly. The idea that a fighter pilot flying over Japan might genuinely know nothing about the most significant weapon of the war seemed implausible. So they asked, and when McDilda told them the truth, they did not believe him. The first interrogation session lasted several hours. It was conducted in a military facility outside Osaka, in a room with bare walls and a single table. McDilda was seated on a wooden chair, his hands unbound, but his movements watched by 2 guards. His injuries had not been treated. His flight suit was still stained with oil and blood. The officer conducting the interrogation spoke English with a formal precision that suggested university training. He asked about McDilda's unit, his missions, his aircraft. McDilda answered truthfully, providing name, rank, and serial number as the Geneva Convention required, and adding details about his fighter group that seemed harmless. Then the questions turned to the bomb. What do you know about the atomic weapon? When will the next one be dropped? How many bombs do the Americans have? McDilda answered that he did not know. He was a fighter pilot. He flew escort missions. He had never been briefed on the atomic program. The officer did not accept this. He repeated the questions, varying the phrasing, looking for inconsistencies. McDilda repeated his answers. The session ended without resolution. The second session was different. It took place in the basement of a different building. The room was smaller, darker, and colder. The officer who entered was not the same man who had conducted the first interrogation. This one was older, harder, and carried a sword. The questions were the same. The stakes were not. The officer made it clear, through statements that needed no translation, that McDilda's life depended on providing useful information. The atomic bomb had killed more than 100,000 people in Hiroshima. The Japanese military needed to understand what was coming next. If McDilda could not help them understand, he was useless. McDilda told the truth again. He knew nothing. The officer drew his sword. This was the moment when the mathematics of survival collapsed into a single point. McDilda had nothing to offer. The truth was worthless. But silence meant death. He understood in some instinctive way that the Japanese were not looking for truth. They were looking for confirmation of their own fears. They already believed the Americans had more bombs. They already believed more cities would be destroyed. What they wanted was detail, specificity, something that would help them prepare. And so Marcus McDilda, a fighter pilot from Wortham, Texas, with no training in nuclear physics and no knowledge of the Manhattan Project, began to describe the atomic bomb. He spoke slowly, as if recalling a briefing he had received months ago. He described the bomb as a device that split atoms, using language he had picked up from popular science magazines and high school physics. He said the active material was placed at the center of a sphere, surrounded by conventional explosives that compressed it to critical mass. None of this was accurate. The actual physics of the implosion-type bomb used at Nagasaki involved precisely shaped explosive lenses and a plutonium core, details that McDilda could not have known. But his description sounded plausible to men who knew even less than he did. He gave numbers. He said the Americans had 100 atomic bombs ready for use. This was a fabrication, but it aligned with Japanese fears about American industrial capacity. The actual number at that moment was closer to 2, with more in production. He named targets. He said the next bombs would fall on Tokyo and Kyoto if Japan did not surrender. This was also a no faults. Kyoto had been specifically removed from the target list by Secretary of War Stimson, who had visited the city before the war and recognized its cultural significance. Tokyo was considered impractical due to the extent of existing bomb damage, but McDilda did not know any of this. He was guessing, inventing, saying whatever might make his story more convincing. The officer with the sword listened. The room was silent except for McDilda's voice, measured and steady despite the terror beneath it. He maintained eye contact when he could, looked down when the fabrication required him to appear to be remembering details. He paused at appropriate moments, as if translating technical concepts into simpler language. He had no idea if they believed him. He had no idea if his story matched anything the Japanese already knew. He was flying blind, navigating by instinct through a conversation that would determine whether he lived or died. The questions continued. How is the bomb delivered? What is the yield? How long does the radiation last? McDilda answered each one with the same mixture of invented detail and confident delivery. He described the bomb as being carried by a specially modified B-29, which was true. He estimated the yield at 20,000 tons of TNT, which was roughly accurate for the Hiroshima bomb and close enough for the Nagasaki weapon. He said the radiation would persist for years, which was partially true, but exaggerated. The officer sheathed his sword. The interrogation continued for another hour, but the dynamic had shifted. McDilda was no longer a useless prisoner to be disposed of. He was an intelligence asset, a source of information that the Japanese command desperately needed. When the session ended, he was taken to a cell rather than an execution yard. His injuries were examined, though not treated with any particular care. He was given water and a small portion of rice. He did not sleep that night. He lay on the concrete floor, replaying the interrogation in his mind, trying to remember exactly what he had said. He had no way of knowing whether his fabrications would be checked against other sources, whether other prisoners had told different stories, whether the contradictions would be discovered and used against him. He had bought time. He did not know how much. The information McDilda provided was transmitted up the Japanese military intelligence chain within hours of the interrogation. Reports containing his claims about the number of bombs, the next targets, and the weapons' capabilities reached senior commanders in Tokyo before dawn on August 10, 1945. The effect of this information is difficult to isolate from the broader context of those final days. Japan was already reeling from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union had declared war and was advancing into Manchuria. The civilian government and the military were locked in an increasingly bitter debate about whether to continue fighting or accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. But the intelligence from Osaka added weight to one side of that debate. The claim that the Americans had 100 atomic bombs ready for use, while false, reinforced the argument that continued resistance was futile. The threat to Tokyo and Kyoto, while also false, suggested that the centers of Japanese culture and governance would be destroyed if surrender did not come quickly. McDilda's fabrications did not cause Japan to surrender. That decision was the result of forces far larger than one pilot's desperate lies. But his interrogation report was one of many pieces of information circulating through the Japanese command in those final days, and it contributed to the atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that made surrender seem like the only rational choice. The irony is that the Japanese military never realized the information was false. In the chaos of the war's end, no systematic effort was made to verify McDilda's claims or compare them against other sources. The interrogation report was filed, referenced in higher-level analyses, and then forgotten as the machinery of surrender took over. McDilda remained in Japanese custody for another week. He was moved twice, each time to a different facility, each time uncertain whether the next destination would be a prison or an execution. Ground. The guards treated him with the same mixture of contempt and indifference that they showed other American prisoners. He was beaten once for reasons that were never explained. He was fed irregularly. His injuries became infected, but did not kill him. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast that most Japanese had never heard before. The war was over. McDilda learned of the surrender from a guard who told him, in broken English, that he would be released soon. He did not believe it until American forces arrived 3 weeks later. The liberation was anticlimactic. McDilda was loaded onto a truck with other prisoners, driven to an airfield, and flown to a hospital ship offshore. His injuries were treated. His story was recorded by intelligence officers who were initially skeptical that a fighter pilot could have provided such detailed information about the atomic bomb. When McDilda explained that everything he had told the Japanese was fabricated, the debriefers were stunned. They asked him to repeat his account several times. They asked how he had known what details to include. McDilda told them the truth, that he had known nothing, that he had invented everything, that he had said whatever seemed most likely to keep him alive. The intelligence officers noted his answers and filed their report. There were no medals for creative lying under threat of execution. There was no formal recognition of what McDilda had done. The military did not know how to categorize his actions, and so they did not categorize them at all. He was processed out of the service in late 1945 and returned to Texas. Marcus McDilda went home to Wortham. He did not speak publicly about his interrogation for many years. The details of what he had told the Japanese and why remained buried in classified files and personal memories. He took a job, married, raised children. He lived the quiet life of a man who had seen things that most people could not imagine and had chosen not to make those things the center of his identity. His neighbors knew he had served in the war. They did not know he had once convinced enemy interrogators that he possessed secrets about the most powerful weapon ever built. In later years, as historians began to piece together the final days of the Pacific War, McDilda's story surfaced occasionally in academic articles and specialized studies. He gave a few interviews, always understated, always reluctant to claim more significance for his actions than he believed they deserved. He died in 1998, in the same state where he had been born. His obituary mentioned his military service, but did not describe the interrogation in Osaka or the lie that had kept him alive. The lesson of Marcus McDilda's survival is not about heroism in the conventional sense. He did not escape from captivity. He did not overpower his guards. He did not sabotage enemy operations or gather intelligence for American forces. What he did was think. In a moment when fear and pain and the certainty of death would have paralyzed most men, McDilda calculated, he understood what his captors wanted to hear. He understood that the truth had no value and that only a convincing fiction could save him. He constructed that fiction under conditions that would have broken most people, and he delivered it with enough confidence to make it believable. The war rewarded many things: bravery, skill, endurance, luck. But it also rewarded thinking, the ability to assess a situation clearly, to recognize what was possible and what was not, to make decisions under pressure that accounted for constraints, rather than ignoring them. Marcus McDilda survived because he kept thinking when everyone around him had stopped. That is not a small thing.